Imagine for a second that you walk into a hardware store, right?
Mm.
Because you need to figure out exactly how hot your oven is getting at home.
Okay, I'm with you.
So you wander the aisles and you grab a standard high-quality metal tape measure. You take it home and you just stick it right into the middle of the heated oven.
I mean, that sounds like a terrible idea.
Right, because what happens, the tape measure it gets completely ruined, the numbers warp, the metal bends, and obviously it gives you absolutely zero information about the actual temperature.
Yeah, of course it doesn't.
But, and here's the kicker, if you pull that ruined tape measure out, stare at it, and declare to the room, I guess this oven has no temperature, you would be completely missing the point.
You'd be making a massive category error.
Exactly. The problem isn't that the reality of the heat doesn't exist, right? The problem is that your tool is just fundamentally mismatched to the reality you're trying to measure.
Right. You're basically demanding that a specific reality conform to a physical tool that was literally never designed to perceive it.
Mm-hmm.
Or, interact with it or quantify it in any meaningful way.
And that image, that completely mismatched tape measure sitting in the oven, is exactly where we are starting today's deep dive.
It's the perfect analogy for what we're looking at today.
It really is, because we've been handed this massive, incredibly dense academic text. It's this imposing 600-plus page volume called the Oxford Handbook of the Epistemology of Theology.
Edited by William J. Abraham and Frederick D. Aquino.
Yes, exactly. And I noticed right off the bat that it's actually dedicated to William Alston and Alvin Plantinga, which, those are two names that carry a ton of weight in philosophical circles.
Oh, absolutely. Total heavy hitters.
But to be perfectly honest, before I even opened the cover, the title itself was just intimidating. Epistemology of Theology. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, right?
Generally speaking, yes. It asks how we know, what justifies our beliefs, how we can be certain of reality.
Right, but usually when you hear about epistemology, it's strictly applied to the hard sciences, or mathematics, or maybe historical methodology. But today, our mission for this deep dive is to explore how we know what we claim to know about God.
And that brings us right back to your tape measure analogy, actually.
Yeah.
Which is a modern, really practical reframing of a very ancient philosophical idea.
Oh, really? Who started that?
Well, in the introduction to this handbook, the editors explicitly invoke Aristotle.
Oh, okay. Wow, we're going right back to the source.
Yeah, specifically, they point to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he outlines what we can call the principle of epistemic fit.
Epistemic fit. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Basically, Aristotle was adamant that you have to fit your epistemic evaluations. So your methods of measuring, verifying, knowing you have to fit them in an appropriate way to the specific subject matter you're investigating.
So, you wouldn't expect a complex historical claim like the causes of the French Revolution to be proven using a geometric equation.
Exactly. Or you wouldn't use a thermometer to judge a poetry contest.
Right. That would be absurd.
It would be. And yet, for a very long time in human history, people have tried to evaluate theological claims using the exact same epistemic tools they use for, say, the natural sciences or pure deductive logic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this principle of epistemic fit, it seems like the skeleton key for this entire deep dive.
It really is the foundation of the whole book.
We are essentially asking, what is the correct tool to measure the divine? And I imagine the answer isn't just a simple mathematical formula.
No, definitely not. And this handbook is really an ambitious attempt to map out all the different tools that have been used historically, and also the ones being developed right now today to do exactly that.
So how is a 600-page book like this even organized?
Well, the book itself is structured into 4 major movements. It starts by looking at epistemic concepts that live strictly within the borders of theology. Things like divine revelation, sacred tradition.
Okay, internal stuff.
Right. Then it moves outward, looking at general epistemic concepts, how we handle testimony, evidence, the actual foundations of human belief.
Got it.
From there, it provides these deep historical samplings, looking at how heavy hitters throughout the centuries built their own specific systems of knowing, usually in response to the crises of their times.
Oh, I love that. Applying it to real history.
Exactly. And finally, it brings us to the present day. It looks at emerging conversations from feminist theology and Pentecostalism to show how this field is just radically evolving.
So our goal today is to give you, the listener, a really comprehensive, unified map of this entire intellectual landscape. We want to save you from information overload while synthesizing all these dense arguments into the vital aha moments that will genuinely change how you think about your own knowledge.
And there are a lot of those aha moments in here.
But to really grasp them, I realized while looking through your notes that we actually have to start by zooming out.
Yeah, we have to look at the big picture first.
Right, because before we can even look at how we know God, we have to understand how the entire overarching field of philosophy has just fundamentally shifted its goals recently.
This is such a crucial point.
The book opens with an essay by John Greco, and he lays out this massive pivot. He talks about what he calls the externalist turn in general epistemology.
Wait, externalist turn, yes.
And reading about this was fascinating because for a long, long time, philosophy seemed totally obsessed with what they called rational reconstructions. Like, it was a discipline entirely defined by fighting skeptics.
Yes. The specter of the skeptic has basically haunted epistemology for centuries.
Right.
I mean, think back to René Descartes, right? Sitting alone by his fire in the 17th century.
Right, the whole I think, therefore I am guy.
Exactly. Descartes instituted a method of radical doubt. He famously wondered if an evil demon was tricking him about everything.
Wait, literally an evil demon?
Yes. He hypothesized this all-powerful deceiver who was tricking him into believing the physical world existed, tricking him about basic math, everything.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. And to defeat this imaginary demon, Descartes felt he had to tear down every single belief he held and build a perfectly rational, bulletproof argument from the absolute ground up, starting only with the knowledge of his own existence.
So it was just this massive arms race of logic.
Precisely. It was all about proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you had the intellectual right to claim you knew something. Usually by defeating that imaginary skeptic who was constantly standing over your shoulder asking, but how are you absolutely 100% sure?
But you're saying general epistemology has recently taken what Greco calls this externalist turn.
Right. It has moved away from those abstract, defensive, internal, rational reconstructions. Instead, it started looking at the actual grounds of ordinary human knowledge.
So looking at how real people actually live.
Exactly. It asks how human beings in the real, physical, messy world actually acquire and sustain knowledge through interaction with their environment.
Oh, I see.
It moves from asking, can I prove the physical world exists, to asking, given that the world exists, what are the actual mechanisms by which a human brain successfully maps it?
And according to Greco, theology has basically followed suit. It's gone through its own version of this, which he calls a social turn.
It's the social turn, yes. It's a huge paradigm shift.
There has been this major structural retreat from traditional apologetics. And by apologetics, we mean the old school debate hall project of trying to definitively prove that God exists to a hostile atheist opponent.
Right, using purely neutral, universally agreed upon premises.
Yeah.
Which is practically impossible.
Exactly. Greco argues that the theological project is no longer about vindication. It's no longer about proving the skeptic on the sidewalk wrong. The project is now about explanation.
Explanation over vindication. That is the key.
The new epistemology of theology asks, what would knowledge of God require for beings like us, physically and socially, and how do ordinary people actually fulfill those requirements?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a monumental shift in intellectual energy. I mean, think about the resources that get freed up when you move away from vindication.
You mean not having to argue all day?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you stop obsessing over whether you can mathematically prove the existence of God to an atheist philosopher who refuses all your basic premises, you can finally start asking much more interesting practical questions.
You move theology out of the sterile debate hall.
Yes, out of the debate hall and into the reality of actual human life. You can start analyzing the mechanics of belief as it actually operates in a person sitting in the pews, or a person in deep distress or profound joy.
I'm trying to picture this shift. So it's like we finally stopped trying to prove to a skeptic that a car engine exists.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. For decades, philosophers were just standing on the sidewalk outside a moving car, refusing to get in, and demanding absolute logical proof of internal combustion before they would even acknowledge the vehicle.
And now the field is saying, look, the car is driving down the road.
Exactly. Real people are in it. They are getting from point A to point B. Instead of arguing with the guy on the sidewalk who refuses to look at the car, let's finally pop the hood and explain exactly how the engine actually works for the person who is actively driving it.
That analogy captures the shift perfectly. We are moving from the project of vindication to the project of explanation. We're looking at the mechanics of the vehicle in motion.
Which is just so much more useful.
It is. But this shift actually brings up a massive secondary issue.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if we are no longer trying to construct bulletproof, undeniable facts to throw at a skeptic, we have to completely redefine what our ultimate intellectual goal actually is.
Oh, I see. Because the goalpost has moved.
Right. If it isn't just acquiring isolated facts to win an argument, what are we actually trying to achieve?
Right. Because if the goal isn't just passing a true-false test, we need a new definition of success. And this leads into an incredibly deep exploration by Jonathan L. Comvig in the Handbook.
Chapter 11. It's a brilliant piece.
It really is. He points out that historically, because epistemology was so utterly dominated by the skeptic, the entire focus got narrowed down to mere knowledge. And knowledge, in this very specific academic context, essentially just means isolated atomic facts.
Yes, the classic example in philosophy is G.E. Moore holding up his hands and saying, here is one hand and here is another.
Wait, really? That was the big philosophical argument?
Yeah, that's the bar the skeptic said. Just prove a single undeniable fact. Prove you have a hand.
That is so wild. But Kvanvig takes us all the way back to the original Greek term, right? Episteme, which is where the word epistemology actually comes from.
Yeah.
And he points out that episteme is actually much closer to our modern concept of understanding, rather than just hoarding a pile of disconnected facts.
The distinction Kvanvig makes here between knowledge and understanding is really the bedrock of this new theological approach.
How does he define understanding, then?
Understanding requires seeing how various aspects of the world are interrelated. It is inherently systemic, it's holistic, and Kvanvig dives into Plato to illustrate this beautifully.
Okay, taking us back to the Greeks again.
Always back to the Greeks.
Yeah.
If you look at Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, Socrates and his interlocutors try desperately to define what knowledge actually is.
And do they figure it out?
No. They try several definitions, like knowledge is perceptions or knowledge is true belief, but they systematically fail. The dialogue literally ends in aporia, which is a state of total confusion as the sun goes down, without a clear answer.
I mean, that is incredibly frustrating. If you're reading it expecting an answer, why would Plato even write that?
Exactly. But Kvanvig points out that you have to read the Theaetetus in conjunction with another dialogue, the Sophist.
Ah, sequel.
Sort of. In the Sophist, Plato introduces a different approach, the method of collection and division.
Collection and division. What does that look like?
Well, instead of trying to define an isolated concept, you collect examples of a phenomena. You see what underlying traits they have in common, and you divide and sort them to map out the larger system. You look for the structural joints of reality.
So you're building a web and not just a single tower.
Exactly. Kvanvig argues that this method of collection and division, this quest for what he calls objectual understanding, is the true goal of epistemology.
And I imagine that is vastly more demanding than just proving a single isolated fact like here is a hand against a skeptic.
Oh, incredibly so. It is about building comprehensive, systematic explanations of reality.
You know, I have to say, wrapping my head around this actually relieves a lot of pressure. It completely changes the vibe of intellectual inquiry for me.
How so?
Well, it's not about passing a pop quiz where you just list disconnected facts that cannot be doubted. It's about grasping the vast, interconnected web of reality.
Which is much more compelling.
It is. And what Kvanvig points out is that this means good theology actually overlaps directly with good philosophy and good science.
Yes. They aren't in competition anymore.
Right. If your goal is holistic understanding, you can't just isolate theology in a corner. You have to synthesize it with everything else you know about the world.
And that synthesis is the highest epistemic good. Understanding is superior to mere knowledge because it requires advanced pattern recognition. It requires you to integrate diverse fields of human inquiry.
Like history, psychology, sociology.
And theology.
Yeah.
Into a coherent worldview. And historically, as Kvanvig notes, this systemic integration is exactly what a highly educated doctor of theology was meant to do.
Oh, right. Back in the medieval university.
Yes. In the medieval university, they weren't just apologists armed with isolated logical proofs to throw at atheists. They were system builders. Their job was to understand the deep structural interrelations of reality.
So by shifting the goal from defending atomic knowledge to pursuing systematic understanding, theological reflection becomes incredibly rigorous, but also profoundly integrated with the rest of human experience.
Exactly. It's a massive upgrade in how we view the task.
Okay, I follow the shift from knowledge to understanding, but this raises a massive red flag for me.
Uh-oh. What's the red flag?
Well, if our goal is this deep, holistic understanding, and we are no longer just relying on perfectly neutral, logically deductive proofs, what raw materials are we allowed to use?
Ah, the data question.
Right. What is the actual data we use to build this understanding? Because if we aren't deducing it like a math problem on a blackboard, where are we getting our information?
This is exactly where the handbook pivots to the nuts and bolts of general epistemology. It focuses on three massive pillars: testimony, evidence, and foundationalism.
Let's start with testimony, which is tackled by Jennifer Lackey in Chapter 13.
Yes, Lackey's work here is fantastic. In rigorous, highly skeptical philosophical circles, testimony, meaning, believing something just because someone else told you it is true, has often been viewed with extreme suspicion.
Right, it's seen as second-rate knowledge. Because the Cartesian ideal, going back to Descartes, is that you have to figure it out for yourself.
Exactly. But Lackey completely dismantles this suspicion by pointing out an undeniable practical reality. Human beings rely on testimony for almost everything in our lives.
Everything. Like what?
Think about it. Our knowledge of food safety, the chemical composition of the medicine we take, the geography of countries we've never visited, historical events, even our own birth dates. It all relies entirely on the reports of others.
Wow. That's actually a wild thought. I only know my birthday because my parents told me and, the hospital printed it on a piece of paper. I have zero independent empirical memory of being born.
None of us do.
If I strictly refused to accept testimony as a valid source of knowledge, my life would be completely paralyzed. I wouldn't even know my own name.
You would be completely epistemically impoverished. Lackey's argument is that since testimony is an absolutely valid foundational epistemic source in literally every other area of human life, it is intellectually inconsistent to suddenly declare it invalid when it comes to religion.
So testimony is a primary data source for the epistemology of theology.
It has to be.
But wait, I have to push back here on behalf of you, the listener, because my alarm bells are ringing right now.
Let's hear it.
Isn't testimony just a polite academic word for hearsay?
Well,
Like, sure, I trust my mom about my birthday because she was literally there. But why should you trust an ancient text or a massive religious institution when it comes to something as complex and universe-altering as the nature of God? How is relying on religious testimony not just a dressed-up version of saying, I believe it because they said so?
that is the exact friction point. And it's why testimony cannot exist in a vacuum. It has to be understood alongside the concept of evidence, which Trendarity explores in Chapter 15.
Okay, bring in the evidence.
People often assume that theology doesn't use evidence at all. They assume it just relies on blind dogma, which sounds exactly like the hearsay you're worried about. But Darity clarifies that theology is absolutely a cognitive discipline that uses evidence.
But what kind of evidence?
The critical nuance is that the evidence it uses is fundamentally testimonial evidence.
Explain how that works mechanically. Because how does a dogma or a text become actual evidence?
Think about a court of law. An eyewitness takes the stand and gives their account. That account is literally entered into the record as evidence.
Right. The jury hears it.
And then the jury has to weigh the reliability of that source. In theology, a thinker might start with a piece of dogma, a creed, or a scripture. Epistemologically speaking, they are treating that dogma as testimonial evidence from a source they deem to be divinely approved.
Whether that source is a continuous historical community, a recognized prophet, or God himself revealing something.
Exactly. The theologian isn't just blindly accepting hearsay. They are actively analyzing testimonial evidence within a structured system of reliability.
Okay, and I'm sorry to keep pushing, you just kicked the can down the road.
How so?
Because the immediate question is, how do you know the source is reliable? If I say, I trust this scripture because the church says it's true, and you ask, why do you trust the church? And I say, because the scripture says the church is true. Well, that's just circular logic.
It is.
Or if I try to logically prove the source's reliability from scratch, I'm right back to the Cartesian trap of trying to build a perfectly logical tower from the ground up.
And you have just perfectly articulated the anxiety that leads us to the third and perhaps most crucial piece of this data-gathering puzzle.
Which is?
Foundationalism. This is addressed by Michael Bergman in Chapter 16.
Foundationalism, that sounds intense.
It often gets a terrible rap in modern philosophy, honestly, because people associate it with those Cartesian excesses, the impossible demand that you must prove every single thing you believe from absolute scratch using undeniable logic.
Right, the evil demon problem.
But Bergman strips foundationalism back to its ancient roots, relying yet again on Aristotle.
Aristotle is doing so much heavy lifting in this book.
He really is the MVP here. Bergman specifically points to Aristotle's regress argument in the posterior analytics. The core idea is incredibly simple, but mechanically profound.
What's the argument?
If you demand a logical proof for every single belief you hold, you fall into an infinite regress.
Walk me through what an infinite regress actually looks like in this context. Let's make it concrete.
Sure. Let's say you believe proposition A. I ask you to prove it, so you offer proposition B as proof. Then I ask you to prove proposition B, so you offer proposition C.
And it just keeps going.
Right. If every belief requires a prior belief to justify it, this chain goes backwards forever. A to B to C to D into infinity. And if the chain never hits a solid foundation, the entire structure of your knowledge is just hovering in midair, supported by absolutely nothing.
So Aristotle recognized that to avoid falling down an endless rabbit hole of, but why? The chain of justification must eventually stop. So the chain has to anchor into something that doesn't need to be proven. Hold on, that sounds like a massive philosophical cop-out.
Yeah.
I don't need proof because this belief is the anchor. How is that logically acceptable?
Because it's exactly how your brain already works. These anchoring beliefs are what philosophers call properly basic beliefs.
Properly basic beliefs.
Yes. They are justified non-inferentially, meaning you don't infer them from a string of logical premises, you just properly perceive them.
Give me an example of something I perceive without inferring it.
Think about your belief that the past actually happened.
Okay.
Can you logically prove to me that the universe wasn't created 5 minutes ago with all of your memories pre-installed?
I mean, no, I guess I can't mathematically prove that, but it feels absurd to doubt it.
Exactly. Your belief in the reality of the past is properly basic, or your belief that other people have independent minds and aren't just highly advanced robots.
Right. I don't logically deduce that my friends have consciousness. I just perceive it as a foundational reality.
This is the absolute heart of what's called reformed epistemology, which is championed by thinkers like Alvin Plantinga. They argue that under the right conditions, belief in God can be properly basic in the exact same way that your belief in the past is basic.
Really? So you don't deduce God from a string of syllogisms?
No, you properly perceive the divine reality.
So synthesizing this, our raw data for theological understanding comes from the testimony of communities and texts, which we weigh as evidence. And this evidence interacts with our properly basic belief, our foundational anchors, to form a coherent worldview.
Yes, beautifully summarized. We aren't just guessing, we are processing specific types of epistemic data.
Okay, and this is a mess, but how do we actually process this data? How do we refine our perception so that our basic beliefs are actually reliable? Because you can't just read a textbook about foundationalism and suddenly understand God.
No, you definitely cannot. And this is where the Handbook takes a massive pivot. It moves from abstract theory to physical reality. So
Yeah.
you have to actually do it.
You have to engage your physical body and your social community in practice.
This is a vital, beating heart of the book, running through several chapters. We move from abstract data collection to the crucible of actual practice. Mark Wynne tackles this by looking at tradition in Chapter 8.
Tradition. Now, when I hear the word tradition, I usually think of a dusty list of rules or a doctrinal creed that gets passed down from generation to generation.
Most people do. But Wynne argues that tradition has a profound phenomenological dimension.
Phenomenological meaning, having to do with direct lived experience.
Exactly. A tradition isn't just a set of ideas. It is a way of experiencing the world. Wynne makes a brilliant distinction here. He compares a Thomist tradition to a Carmelite tradition.
Let's break those down.
So, if you look at the Thomist tradition following Thomas Aquinas, it might be very doctrinally focused. It's characterized by immense systematic theology, logical precision, intellectual rigor.
Very academic.
Yes. But if you look at the Carmelite tradition, like the writings of St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, it is highly experientially focused. It deals with the dark night of the soul, mystical union, intense emotional terrain.
They're completely different tape measures.
Exactly. And Wynne's crucial point is that you absolutely cannot assess a tradition through armchair theorizing.
Yeah.
You can't just read a summary of Carmelite mysticism on Wikipedia and say, okay, I get it, I can evaluate this.
You have to look at the enacted example.
You have to look at the lives of the people actually living the tradition, because the tradition is the practice itself.
Because the act of doing literally changes the knower. I love this concept. Colin McGuigan and Brad Kallenberg explore this deeply when they talk about ecclesial practices.
Right, Chapter 9.
They argue that social practices, things like liturgy, communal singing, or shared charity, actually transform us epistemically. Engaging in these physical, repetitive practices trains a human cognizer for what they call skilled perception.
Let's expand on that, because skilled perception is one of the most important concepts for everyone listening to take away today. How would you describe it?
I think of it like a master sommelier tasting wine.
Oh, perfect.
If you and I drink a glass of Cabernet, we might take a sip and say, yep, tastes like red wine, kind of dry. That's the limit of our perception.
Right.
But the master sommelier takes a sip of the exact same liquid and perceives notes of leather, blackberry, toasted oak. They can tell you it came from a specific hillside in France during a particularly rainy summer 10 years ago.
It's the exact same data, but radically different perception.
Exactly. Or think of a birder spotting a hawk in the sky. To me, looking up is just a dark speck moving against the clouds. To the trained birder, it's obviously and undeniably a red-tailed hawk based on the wing shape and the flight pattern.
And crucially, how did the sommelier and the birder acquire that perception?
Not by reading a book. You don't just know it's a red-tailed hawk because you read an encyclopedia of birds. You know it because you have physically been out in the field with binoculars for hundreds and hundreds of hours.
You've put the practice in.
And more importantly, you have been trained by a community of other, more experienced birders who pointed up and said, look there, see that shape? That's what you're looking for. Your physical practices, guided by a community, have literally rewired your brain's capacity to perceive reality.
That is the exact mechanism being described here, but applied to the epistemology of theology. Your brain is a muscle that must be trained to perceive the divine.
Which brings us to Frederick Aquino, one of the editors, and his chapter on spiritual formation.
Yes. Aquino takes this to its logical, historical conclusion. To illustrate how ancient this idea is, he uses the example of John Cassian.
Who was he?
Cassian was a foundational monastic figure from the late 4th and early 5th centuries. He wrote extensively about the practices of the Desert Fathers.
Okay, so, deep in the ascetic tradition, what did Cassian believe about how we gain knowledge?
For Cassian, becoming a true knower of divine things is absolutely impossible without deep, sustained immersion in ascetic spiritual practices. We were talking about prayer, fasting, prolonged silence, radical charity.
It's intense physical discipline.
And crucially, just like your birder analogy, Cassian insists it requires reliance on reliable spiritual authorities.
Yeah.
Elders who have already honed their perception.
Right, because you cannot train yourself to have skilled spiritual perception in a vacuum. Your ego will trick you.
Exactly. You need the master birder to point out the hawk the first 50 times before your eyes adjust to see it yourself.
And this is where we have to shatter a massive modern misconception. We tend to think of spiritual formation, things like fasting or cultivating patience, as purely a moral project. We think it's just about becoming a good person.
But epistemologically speaking, Aquino argues that spiritual formation is fundamentally about becoming a reliable knower. The virtues you cultivate, humility, patience, attentiveness, actually condition your cognitive faculties.
Wait, so you're saying that being arrogant or greedy literally makes you stupider when it comes to perceiving certain truths?
Yes. The way you live physically and morally literally changes what you are intellectually capable of perceiving and knowing about reality.
Wow.
Without those rigorous practices stripping away your biases and distractions, the reality of the divine remains entirely invisible to you. Just as the subtle notes of the French oak remain completely invisible to the untrained palate of the casual wine drinker.
This is such a radical shift from that Cartesian brain in a vat idea we started with. Descartes thought you could just sit in a chair, close your eyes, and think your way to absolute truth.
And this framework insists that you cannot separate your physical bodily habits from your intellectual capacity to know God. The tape measure has to be forged in a very specific fire before it can measure anything accurately.
It's an incredibly embodied epistemology.
It truly is.
So, how has this actually played out in the real world? Because it's one thing to talk about skilled perception in theory, but history is messy.
Oh, very messy.
The Handbook doesn't just stay in the abstract. A massive chunk of it is dedicated to historical samplings. It looks back at the Christian tradition to see how different heavy hitters actually built their own systems of knowing to survive the crises of their specific eras.
And this historical perspective is vital because it proves that there has never been just one single monolithic epistemology of theology.
Right.
Different eras with completely different Political and social anxieties required entirely different epistemic frameworks.
Let's look at 3 dramatically different examples from the text to see how this works in practice.
Mhm.
Richard Hooker, Karl Barth, and Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Great choices. Let's start with Richard Hooker, who is covered by A.S. McGrade. Hooker is operating in late 16th century Elizabethan England.
Okay, so this is a time of massive political and religious instability. The Reformation has happened, and Hooker is trying to intellectually justify the religious laws and structure of the Church of England against intense, radical Puritan opposition.
And what was the core of the Puritan epistemological argument?
Well, the Puritans basically wanted a strictly deductive biblical epistemology. They argued that every single practice, law, and church structure had to be explicitly dictated by Scripture alone.
If it wasn't in the Bible, you couldn't do it.
Exactly. But Hooker realizes that this kind of rigid, single-source epistemology will lead to total social chaos. So he builds a broader epistemology to counter it, relying on what becomes a famous triad: Scripture, tradition, and human reason.
Right, the three-legged stool.
He argues that you cannot just read Scripture in a vacuum. You have to use human reason, and you must respect the historical tradition of the Church to interpret the text correctly and apply it to modern life.
Notice what Hooker's doing here. He is building an epistemology designed to create social and religious stability. His system is highly institutional, very systematic, and deeply pragmatic.
He is creating an epistemic fit for a nation trying to avoid tearing itself apart.
Exactly. Now, fast forward a few centuries and contrast Hooker's highly structured institutional approach with Karl Barth, who is discussed by Paul T. Nimmo.
Karl Barth, so we're in the 20th century now.
Right, and Barth's primary epistemological anxiety is completely, radically different from Hooker's. Barth isn't worried about institutional stability at all.
What's he worried about?
He is terrified of human arrogance. Specifically, he is terrified of turning God into an idol.
Wait, let me admit some confusion here. When I hear the word idol, I think of a golden calf from the Old Testament, or a literal statue that someone bows down to. How does using human reason or theology turn God into a literal idol?
It's about intellectual idolatry. An idol is really just anything you create that you then treat as ultimate reality. Barth argues that if you rely on human reason or human tradition as your starting point for knowing God like Hooker did, you inevitably end up projecting your own human ideas, biases, and cultural assumptions onto the divine.
Oh, I see.
You create a mental concept of God that looks suspiciously like your own society, and then you worship that concept. You have built an intellectual idol.
So it's the tape measure problem again, but much more dangerous. Barth is essentially saying, stop trying to measure the infinite creator of the universe with your tiny, flawed human tools, because whatever you measure will just be a reflection of yourself.
Exactly. You cannot capture the infinite with finite categories.
Yeah.
Therefore, Barth builds an epistemology based entirely on divine initiative.
Meaning God has to make the first move.
Right. He argues that knowing God is only possible through God's own grace. We can only know God because God actively chooses to reveal himself through the Word.
So for Barth, knowledge of God is a form of faith. It is not an achievement of human reason. It is a gift granted to us.
His epistemology is a radical, humbling critique of human intellectual confidence.
That is a staggering contrast to Hooker. And then we have a third figure, Hans Urs von Balthasar, covered by Victoria S. Harrison.
Balthasar is fascinating. He's also a 20th century figure, a Swiss Catholic theologian. But his focus brings us right back to the idea of physical practice and skilled perception.
How so?
Balthasar focuses intensely on the deep connection between Christian experience and what he calls the form of Christ. For Balthasar, you absolutely cannot separate the academic study of theology from the pursuit of holiness.
So he insists that the true theologian must be a saint.
Yes, it's exactly what we were just talking about with Cassian and the Desert Fathers. You cannot do proper, rigorous theology if you are not actively pursuing a holy, contemplative life, because without holiness, your perceptual faculties are literally blinded.
The intellectual and the spiritual are inextricably linked.
They are one and the same.
It's wild to think about how these vastly different theories actually survived the real world. I mean, Hooker is building a system for a nation. Barth is tearing down human idolatry. Balthasar is fusing intellectual inquiry with deep spiritual contemplation.
But this diversity is a feature of the tradition, not a bug. It demonstrates clearly that the epistemology of theology is not a monolith.
There is no single perfect formula.
Right. Each of these thinkers developed a specific, highly rigorous framework to answer the specific anxieties and challenges of their unique era and context. They were all trying to find the appropriate epistemic fit for the crises they faced.
Which brings us perfectly to the final and perhaps most challenging section of our deep dive. Because this search for epistemic fit isn't just ancient history. And it didn't stop with the 20th century theologians either.
No, it's very much ongoing.
The way we think about theological knowledge is still evolving rapidly right now. The Handbook's final section, Emerging Conversations, is fascinating because it brings in voices that were historically sidelined, marginalized, or completely ignored by the mainstream academy.
And these voices are aggressively pushing the boundaries of what counts as rigorous knowledge.
They're introducing entirely new methodologies. Chapter 40 by Harriet A. Harris focuses on the epistemology of feminist theology. And the core, incredibly profound concept she introduces here is the validation of the epistemological paradox.
Let's unpack this because traditional philosophy hates paradox.
It truly does. Historically, Western philosophy has tried to evade paradox at all costs. The gold standard, the ultimate ideal, was a clean, deductive, entirely rational system where every premise logically led to a neat conclusion without any contradictions.
Harris calls this the ideal of height.
Right. The goal was to stand high above the messiness, the suffering, and the confusion of the physical world and look down with perfect, detached, objective rationality.
But feminist theology forcefully argues that to evade paradox is to evade the complexity of real life. And if you evade complexity, you are evading truth.
You cannot understand the human condition from a position of detached height. Harris uses a truly striking, unforgettable example in the text to illustrate this.
The Sarajevo cellist, right?
Yes. She talks about the famous image of the cellist playing music in the rubble of besieged Sarajevo during the Bosnian War. Or she points to the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, who wrote his legendary Leningrad Symphony while literally starving in a city besieged by the Nazis, surrounded by freezing temperatures, war, and mass death.
Now, think about how traditional, hyper-rational epistemology views those scenarios.
Right.
If you use the standard metrics of logic and observable data, you look at a besieged, starving city, and you just see destruction. You see the total diminishment of human capability. It is a void of meaning.
But the paradoxical reality, the actual lived truth of the situation, is that profound truth, beauty, and humanity emerged from that exact diminishment.
Exactly.
When Shostakovich composed that symphony, or when the cellists played in the rubble, the music they created wasn't just a psychological escape from the horror. It wasn't just a comforting distraction. It was a rigorous realization of truth within the horror.
And that is the epistemic breakthrough. Harris argues that we do not find ultimate truth by avoiding discrimination, suffering, or physical diminishment. We find expansive understanding by going down into it.
Going down instead of up to the height?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is through the very process of self-emptying or confronting dangerous, painful, paradoxical realities that a much deeper, wider understanding of the divine and the human emerges.
Truth and diminishment. That completely upends the traditional rational ideal. It says that depth, rather than detached objective height, is the true source of expansive theological knowledge. It rigorously revalidates lived experience, especially suffering and bodily vulnerability, as a highly valid epistemic source. It's breathtaking.
It is a radical expansion of the tape measure. And we see a parallel shift, a different kind of expansion, in chapter 41, where James K. Smith writes about Pentecostal epistemology.
Pentecostalism, that's one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world, right? Characterized by highly experiential, emotionally expressive worship.
Yes. But historically, it hasn't always been taken seriously by academic philosophers because it doesn't look like traditional European theology.
Right. It's not a bunch of guys in tweed jackets writing syllogisms.
Exactly. But Smith changes the academic conversation by introducing the rigorous concepts of narrative knowledge and narrative causality. He argues that Pentecostalism operates on a completely different register from the deductive logic of traditional philosophy, but it is no less valid.
What exactly does he mean by narrative causality? Because when I hear causality, I think of physics. You know, one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball.
What you are describing is efficient causality, the mechanical, physical chain of events studied by physicists. But Smith points out that human beings don't primarily navigate the world through efficient causality. We navigate it through narrative.
Okay, through stories.
Think about the absolute centrality of testimony and storytelling in a Pentecostal church. When a believer stands up and shares a raw, emotional story of personal healing, or deliverance from addiction, or a sudden transformation of their life trajectory, They are not just sharing a nice anecdote to warm the crowd.
What are they doing epistemologically?
Epistemologically speaking, they are providing rigorous narrative data.
They are mapping how the divine interacts with the world.
Yes, they are demonstrating narrative causality. They are showing how a story, an encounter, or a spiritual experience caused a fundamental shift in reality. Understanding why a person completely changed their life after a spiritual encounter requires understanding the narrative causality of that event.
And Smith argues that this narrative knowledge, the know-how that is implicit in active charismatic spirituality, is just as real, just as rigorous, and just as valid an epistemic tool as the efficient causality studied by a scientist. So, synthesizing these emerging conversations, what we are seeing is that modern movements like feminist theology and Pentecostalism are successfully challenging the strict, rigid, purely deductive logical frameworks of the past.
They aren't throwing away knowledge. They are expanding our definition of what counts as a valid epistemic tool.
They validate lived experience, suffering, embodied practice, paradox, and storytelling as highly rigorous ways of accumulating and processing theological understanding. They are handing us entirely new tape measures designed for complex lived realities that the old, rigid tools simply couldn't register.
It is a phenomenal expansion of the field.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today. Let's try to summarize this incredible journey for everyone listening to give them a comprehensive takeaway of this massive handbook.
We started by looking at the big picture. The realization that the entire field of epistemology and theological philosophy specifically has undergone a massive shift. We have moved away from the defensive internal project of vindication,
Where Descartes tries to prove reality exists, or the apologist tries to forcefully prove God's existence to a skeptic.
right? Instead, we've moved toward the external, practical project of explanation, understanding how actual living human beings experience and map the reality of God in their daily lives.
From there, we learned that hoarding isolated atomic facts, mere knowledge, like proving a hand exists, is not the ultimate goal. The true epistemic good is understanding.
It is the Platonic ideal of grasping the vast interconnected web of reality, seamlessly integrating theology, philosophy, and lived experience into a holistic system.
We then established that we have valid, robust data to build this understanding. We don't have to rely purely on deduction. We can rely on the testimony of communities, treating it as vital evidence.
And we can trust in our properly basic foundational beliefs, the non-inferential anchors of our perception, to avoid falling into an endless, paralyzing, infinite regress of, but why?
Then we hit the crucible of practice. We saw that you absolutely cannot just think your way to this understanding from an armchair. You have to live it.
Engaging in historical tradition, physical ecclesial practices, and rigorous ascetic spiritual formation literally rewires your brain. It gives you the skilled perception necessary to see realities that are invisible to the untrained ego, just like the master birder spotting the hawk in the distance.
And finally, we saw that this entire process is historically dynamic. Whether you are an Elizabethan scholar like Hooker trying to build a stable society, Karl Barth fighting the idolatry of human arrogance, a 20th century feminist finding expansive truth in the agonizing depths of suffering, or a Pentecostal preacher mapping the world through narrative knowledge, you are doing the exact same thing.
You are using a specific, rigorous epistemological framework to make sense of the divine. You are finding the precise epistemic fit for your reality.
And this brings us right back to you, the listener, because the ultimate takeaway from this 600-page academic tome is that you, right now, have an epistemology.
You do.
The way you are consuming and analyzing this very deep dive, the specific traditions you hold dear, the people and institutions you instinctively choose to trust, the physical daily habits you practice, all of that forms your personal epistemic framework. You have your own tape measure. You have your own skilled perception that you have been unconsciously honing over a lifetime.
Which leads us to a final, somewhat provocative thought to leave you with, drawn from a fascinating chapter we haven't fully explored yet, Chapter 19 by Nathan L. King and Thomas Kelly, which focuses entirely on the epistemology of disagreements.
Oh, this is the perfect wrench to throw into the gears right at the end.
It really is. We've spent this entire hour talking about how your specific traditions, your physical practices, and your trusted authorities give you a valid, rigorous, skilled perception of the truth. You have trained your eyes to see the hawk. But here is the ultimate challenge for you to chew on. What happens when you meet an epistemic peer? What happens when you meet someone from a completely different tradition, who is just as intelligent as you, who is engaged in their own rigorous practices, trusted their own reliable authorities, honed their own skilled perception, and they perceive a divine reality that completely, fundamentally contradicts yours?
It's the ultimate collision. When two master birders look at the exact same patch of sky, using the exact same quality of binoculars, and they see two completely different mutually exclusive birds.
Exactly. The philosophical question is this: should the mere awareness of their disagreement, the simple awareness that an intellectual peer has reached a different conclusion using a valid framework, force you to lower your confidence in your own beliefs?
Oh, that's tough.
In modern epistemology, there's a prominent view called conciliationism, which suggests that yes, perhaps it should. If you truly respect their epistemic process and their intellect, their disagreement must logically carry weight against your certainty. So the question we leave you with is, how resilient is your skilled perception when it collides with someone else's? When your carefully forged tape measure gives a reading of 100 degrees and their equally well-crafted tape measure reads 0, how do you navigate that space without retreating into arrogance or falling into total skepticism?
That is a question that will absolutely keep you up at night. And it perfectly proves that the epistemology of theology isn't just an abstract, dusty academic exercise for a university classroom. It is the very foundation of how we navigate, survive, and understand our complex, pluralistic world. Thank you all for joining us on this comprehensive deep dive into these sources. Keep questioning the tools you use, keep honing your skill perception, and keep asking exactly how you know what you know.